Hi, can you all hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I've never had such a beautiful intro. I thought I'd joined two meetings by accident. I was like, should I be hearing all this beautiful music? Um, so hi and thank you so much for having me speak with you all today.
Sorry, Lucy, we're just going to do a wee quick intro and then we'll bring you in if that's okay.
Lovely, thank you.
That's okay. No, I'm the same. It's all right. We all heard the music too. It wasn't just you.
Okay.
Yeah. We've just got a couple of people still taking their seats here, and then we'll get everyone settled in.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, I think that's us good to go then. So welcome everyone. I'm Katie Kelly. I'm your chair for today. And if you're in for Deep Dive 2.5, you're in the right place. So I'm pretty sure, don't leave now. Once you're in, the doors will be locked. Come on in, guys, and join us. We're just starting. So we're absolutely delighted to be here with you today. And really what we want as a panel, it's Friday afternoon, we want to really inspire change with you today. We want you to learn something today that will cause you to do something differently going forward. We've got an amazing panel here from across the world, from India, from America, right across the world, who in Australia. In fact, Russ is here and it's 10:30 at night in Australia and he should be drinking Australian good wine, but he's not doing it because he's doing this for us today. So we've got a brilliant panel here that are going to share stories with you about brilliant practice, things that work really well, things that are about serving local people and deeply involving them. And the work that they're going to describe to you is making brilliant change happen for people. So we really want you to be inspired by that and to figure out, okay, what can I do with that change? What can I learn? How can I follow up? So for the start of the session, we're just going to ask you to do a wee Slido just to say, what do you want to get out of this session today? Because it's good for our panel to see that before we start. So if you all know how to do the Slido, just scan that wee code that's there and just put in what you would like to get out of this session today. And while you're doing that, what's going to happen is our panel will introduce themselves. And as I say, they're esteemed from absolutely across the world. And they'll introduce themselves and they're going to speak briefly about the work that they've done. And not just about saying how brilliant it is, they're going to talk about the things that have gone well and about how that could change and how we could link that together. And then we're going to have an opportunity for some questions and discussion. So I'm just wondering if there's anything coming through from the Slido yet to see. Not seeing anything. So just asking you to scan that. What would you get out of today? Does that appear somewhere, Francie? Oh. There we go. Fresh ideas on engaging a historically hard to engage groups. Well, I think we've got that really well covered today. Absolutely, people are pleased about that. Inspiration for innovative approaches, co-design approaches, understand how evidence can be leveraged to fill some critical gaps in the social outcome space. You are all definitely in the right space today. We've got answers to these questions that are going to be coming up. Okay, so really without further ado, I'm just going to go straight into these presentations. You're going to hear a lot of presentations one after the other, but what to do is while you're listening, listen intently and just take a few notes or write down any questions you might have at the end or any clarification or I want to do that, but here's what's stopping me. We're interested in that because the panel can tell you how they've overcome challenges as well. So you're going to see a lot of presentations, take some notes as you go, and then we'll be able to pull some of your questions out in the last half hour of the session, if that's okay. So we're hoping that this will be the best session of the conference, and we're hoping that you're going to change the world after we move on. So without further ado then, I'm going to pass on to Lucy, who's online, and she's from Kirk Lee's Better Outcomes Partnership. Lucy, over to you.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. I know when I'm supposed to speak now. Thank you so much for having me speak with you all today. So my name's Lucy and I was really privileged to be a part of the peer-led lived experience group work that was the focus of the research project by GoLab. So I will briefly talk through, there's a fantastic visual recording. Hopefully you guys can see it on the slides. And it sums up our experience really beautifully. There it is. It's absolutely gorgeous. If you can get a chance to look at this more in depth today, If you've got any opportunity, then I'd really recommend you do so. So the group was formed from those with histories of addiction, those that had been in abusive relationships. And what we really found was that the approach transcended specific adverse experiences and was transformational for everybody involved. So there's recurring themes throughout, and I'll just dip into little bits of my lived experience as well, just to give you the context. So if you could go to the next slide, please, John. Thank you. So what we all found as a group were that traditional services were really reinforcing limiting beliefs, low self-esteem at a time when we were the most vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, speaking from my experience, I'm a teacher, I'm a mother, I'm a very capable person, but after fleeing a domestically abusive relationship, I couldn't even make a sandwich. I remember one day I got the pieces of bread out and I couldn't remember what to do next. I was completely in fight or flight, involved with lots of services, and you trust them implicitly. Some were very good and helped me find my way back. Others were not so. So you can see, hopefully, from this beautiful illustration, that we felt it made us feel unsafe. So, for example, for me, after fleeing the relationship, I was involved with the police, family court, because we have a son together. My ex developed schizophrenia and had made threats to kill. The police had phoned me and just said, "Oh, have you seen him today? Because he said he might come and cause some problems." So there, you know, what I was then kind of afflicted with, okay, my positionality as a woman in the eyes of the police. Then in family court, the judge had read 14 allegations, one of which being really serious sexual assault, and then said, "This just looks like an unhappy relationship." We all found that we all had very similar stories of these comments or sentences or interactions that were completely devastating. Some of us found that was over a protracted time, weeks, months, years. And some of us, it might have been a couple of anecdotal interactions, all just as devastating as each other. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay. So having been through all these traditional services, some of us ending up feeling like, well, my situation's just inevitable then. The professionals think this, and it just reaffirms what I already thought about myself. Working with Pennine Domestic Abuse Services, that's in collaboration with KBOC, Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, did not feel like services at all. This felt like collaboration. As you can see from the illustration, all those person-centered approaches and strengths-based approaches really made us feel like we were in charge of our own actualization. It felt like our voices were front and center. They were the most valuable thing. Our experiences were prized and precious and important. It's as though our insights became the strength, the ultimate strength that we needed to grow each other, to grow ourselves, and to grow our wider group and community. So this was consistently affirming in every interaction. We were kind of in charge. We were trusted with that. And I was working with people who understood. I was in the living proof of people that had survived through it. So immediately my belief system was turned on its head. I was face to face with some other people that have been through similar things and survived to tell the tale. I don't know how much I've rushed through this, but I would like to finish just with a bit of a call to action. Yes, thank you, John. I think what really needs to happen is training in investment and some real embedding of this approach throughout organizations. The person-centered, real person-centered, strengths-based approach with lived connections and lived experiences feels like I'm growing you, you're growing me, and in turn, we're growing our wider community. The transformative nature feels permanent. It's yours to keep forever, and it's yours to build on as a friend, colleague, mother, father, wherever you are within your community. It's long lasting and never ending, really. So I've had a great experience with Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership and GoLab. That's how they ran their peer-led research, and that's how KBOP operates. Okay. And I think, guys, from me, that's probably it. I'm sorry if I've thank you. I'm sorry if I've rushed.
So much. No, you didn't rush, and thank you so much for giving so much of yourself. If there's any other reason and call to action to work differently, it's the quote for me: services are reinforcing limiting beliefs and low self-esteem. That was fantastic, and thank you for being so courageous and sharing your own story.
No problem.
Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to move on now, and we're going to hear from Louise and Alison from Social Finance and Educate Girls.
Thank you very much. My name is Louise Saville. I'm co-founder and director of Social Finance, and I jointly lead our team that is focused on working in low and middle income countries. And I'm really conscious, Lucy, after that amazingly personal and moving presentation, that I'm about to shoot us right up to thinking about some of the system issues around locally led working, really at a global level. And that's really the genesis of the work that we're going to talk about today. Alice and I both work in the international development community, and there is a lot of talk at the moment among government donors. So higher income country donors like the US or the UK or France, there's a lot of talk and a lot about wanting to work more with locally based organizations as opposed to international NGOs. And by local in that context, what they really mean is nationally domiciled. So if you're working in Kenya, you're working with a Kenyan-based organization. Even below that is then the more community-based organizations. So we're really talking about local from the global perspective here, and what that means and how we get more of that happening. Now, why is that important? I think for all the reasons that people in this room will really understand, which is that organizations that are working and based locally, particularly community-based organizations, just have an unprecedented, a really different quality of insight into the needs and potential solutions for the problems that those communities are encountering, and therefore are uniquely well positioned, potentially, to serve those populations, to meet those needs. The challenge being that big organizations like USAID or FCDO or others, these big government funders from higher income countries, really struggle to know how to get funding to these organizations. They don't have the manpower on the ground to figure out which organizations are the best ones to fund. You know, these organizations don't necessarily have really sophisticated finance or data reporting systems that they would be used to if they were working with the likes of Oxfam, etc. And so, you know, there's a real just disconnect between this intent, and the intent is real. In November 2021, USAID announced 2 targets. They want to get 25% of their funding to locally led partners by 2025. So that's coming up pretty quickly. And 50% of their funding flowing to locally led organizations by 2030, also not that far away. However, if we can go to the next slide, what we see at the moment is only 6% of that global bilateral funding, so government to country level funding, is going to NGOs that are registered in the Global South. So there is a big gap at the moment between this really ambitious and inspiring rhetoric to get more funding, more community-led and delivered programming, and the reality of how much funding is really flowing in that direction. And I'm not going to take up much more airspace because I think the really interesting piece that we want to talk about today is an approach that Educate Girls has trialed to how this might work. both to scale their impact, but also to potentially influence and evidence to this bigger donor community how this could work in practice. But there are a set of us as organisations, including Oxfam Kenya, Village Enterprise, Educate Girls, who are starting to pull together key change makers in this space to really think about, are there ways, particularly that outcomes-based approaches might be able to help bridge that gap? And on the one hand, provide the accountability that these big donors are asking for, whilst on the other hand, creating the opportunity for flexible delivery that would really take advantage of community skills and understanding. So that's the broader context for what we're going to talk about today. And now Alison's going to be talking about her experiences, or Educate Girls' experiences from the Project Mate Tree.
Exactly. So thank you so much. A great introduction. And we're really, really excited about being the first sort of case study around this idea of using an outcomes-based approach to really drive more funding going locally and better performance at a local level through hyperlocal organizations. So some of you will know Educate Girls because of the development impact bond that we piloted, the very first one in India and in education back in finishing in 2018. And a lot's happened since then, but we haven't gone on to use another impact bond ourselves. But what we have done as an organization is learnt so much from the outcomes-based approach. And I mean, we've just outcomes-based approached addicts now. Everything we think about doing, has that lens on it. And so we were growing fast. We used the DIB to mobilize some funding, real scale funding, to take what was in 5,000 villages to 35,000 villages across India, with an outcomes-based approach to the grant. So we had full flexibility in how we use that. And that really enabled us to think, well, how are we going to be different actually about how we deliver as we scale? We really had to question, do we really want to scale our organization? And yes, we needed to meet the ambition of the target to a degree. And so we have grown quite considerably. But we also wanted to experiment with the idea of not growing our footprint per se, but just growing our impact. And that when we decided to move to a new state for us entirely, Bihar, we thought this was an ideal opportunity to use a new way of working. So we really wanted to rapidly scale up, but didn't want to expand our own organization. If we could go to the next slide. So we are a locally led organisation ourselves, but we really wanted to get hyper local and really work with much smaller organisations that notoriously find it difficult to find funding. And we thought, our board pushed back, said, I'm not sure about scaling activities, about scaling your quality delivery of programme. But we pushed back and said, we feel that we can do this through an outcomes-based approach. Let's scale our outcomes, but let's be fully agnostic about the approach with our partners. So in 2022, we identified at first 7 partners. We've now grown to 17 partners. We structured an approach to working with them where we tied funding to outcome milestones across 5 tranches. We gave our partners full flexibility in delivery, but where we provided intensive capacity building support and technical advice was around performance management. So we were insistent on very rigorous data and performance management, but very agnostic about the actual delivery. So the targets were jointly set in collaboration with the locally led organisations, but the programmatic delivery was left entirely to the organisations themselves. If we could go to the next slide. And it's been successful to date, so we're really thrilled. We built attrition into the programme. We lost 2 organisations, but 2 out of 21 is fantastic, we believe. And we're getting really great feedback from the partners that they are being enabled to deliver what the communities want, what the communities need. And they're really excited by this focus on data and verification that brings the accountability that we need for the donors, but they've also seen it drive their own performance, and organisations are really grateful for that level of support. So yeah, back to so Social Finance have been looking into this as a kind of third-party organisation to really sort of stress test whether what we're saying is working, and I think you're Yeah, good findings.
Yeah, so really excitingly, and I should stress that we weren't doing an impact evaluation. We were really looking into the mechanics of how this was structured and how this was run. But you have had an impact evaluation that showed very good results. Excitingly, it showed good results, and I think this will resonate with the broader community and help to build the case for doing this. Good results at a lower cost than direct delivery of the services would have incurred. And I think there were some really, through extensive interviews and document reviews over the last few weeks, we've been able to identify some real levers for why that is happening. And, contracting in that really flexible way that Alison described has been really, really key, has allowed community-based organisations to leverage their own ways of working, but also really respond to the needs of the community. Really putting data at the centre and giving community-based organisations access actually to your data and finance systems to help them to monitor their own performance and manage their own performance has been really enabling. And then I think having that real laser-sharp focus on outcomes as the key sort of metric of whether a partnership is working has been really key in both driving the impact, but also creating that accountability. And just to link that back to what I was talking about at the beginning, we think this is really exciting because we think this is the first example, and we hope it will be the first example of many, that we can then sort of talk about and push up to these bilateral funders to say, there is a different way that you can do this. And that maybe the way to get more funding flowing in the short term isn't necessarily to expect a massive organisation like USAID to be able to contract immediately with a tiny community-based organisation, but is to look at, and some of you who were in the Fragile States session earlier this morning might have heard Christina talking about this as well, but to really think about reimagining the role of bigger NGOs and international NGOs and the role that they can play vis-a-vis enabling more funding to flow to these locally led organisations, whereby, their systems and their contracts and their ways of working are trusted by these donors. Actually, how can they leverage that to support and enable that funding to flow? And so we are starting to convene, and we'll be convening a working group around that. We will also be, we're also working with partners to raise, to set off more pilots around this. And if anyone would like to fund any of this work, please let us know.
Well, there was a call to action. Thank you so much for using Alison. And I think that the big word trust coming up there was a few words that floated to the surface for me was about being flexible. I love this agnostic about the approach or the delivery, respecting local people and what it means and feels like. That's so important. So I'm sure we'll pick up on those going forward and be ready now to have your checkbooks at the end of this session. The doors are locked. So we're going to move on now to Dr. Ria from the Indian School of Development Management.
Thanks a lot, Katie. Thanks to both of you for setting the context for India. So basically, I am Dr. Ria Sinha, and I am the research lead for Center for Innovative Finance and Social Impact. It's a center for excellence at the Indian School of Development Management. So I'll be specifically talking about the work which we are doing in amplifying the not-for-profits voices, because that's a very strong thing which we are doing. So yeah, John, we can move to the next. So very briefly speaking, outcomes-based contracting is not very new in India. There have been partnerships, government partnerships, where outcomes-based contracting has been quite a lot in focus. For example, in 2015, the Swachh Bharat mission, which was the Clean India initiative, that was a large-scale performance-based program in which the Indian states were given certain incentives for like cleaning up, for open defecation-free environment, and improving the waste management in the rural areas. So definitely there are positives and negatives, to what extent the program has been successful, but the performance-based management has been implemented there as well. If I talk about the outcomes-based financing and the outcomes-based bonds, the development impact bonds in India, definitely there have been cases of 5 to 6 cases, not very much, quite limited in the outcome space. But yes, it is gradually rising. It is gradually taking a lot of momentum, but still at the very initial and the pilot stages. That apart, like some of the examples of DIB are definitely Educate Girls, as most of you know, Utkrist Impact Bond, Skill Impact Bond, Quality Education India Bond, Back to School DIB. So these are some of the newer bonds which are still continuing. And there is a lot, I would say, traction in these areas, but the involvement of the government has been quite low in the uptake of the DIBs. That apart, there has been ongoing efforts for a very long period of time to standardize outcomes budgeting at both the union and the center levels in order to increase the transparency and accountability of the budgets. So that has also been something which has been tying the budgets to the outcomes is another thing which India has been trying for some time. And though some of the Indian states are already tried to experiment with outcomes-based budgeting, but not all. But definitely the center has a mandate to do that. That apart, we have the social stock exchange in India. Many of you might know about the social stock exchange. There have been experiences or instances where the social stock exchange have been very unsuccessful, but very, very limited areas where it has been actually successful. India has implemented it just some time back, and 6 to 8 months down, the time has been 6 to 8 months. It's going on well. There have been 6 to 7 NPOs, 6 to 7 enterprises who have already raised funds to the social stock exchange. I'll move to the next slide. So what we are hearing for the past 2 days, a lot of OBF and the DIBs and the SIBs. So very, like in a nutshell, the lessons learned are a lot, I would say, but definitely to specify some of the important lessons which we are learning from here is definitely OBF is not for every NPO down there. It is definitely for NPOs who have the certain absorptive capacity, has a certain budget, has certain amount of employees in the organization who can actually drive the outcomes. So definitely, I would say that NPOs, for the smaller NPOs, the proposition of onboarding an OBF contract is very, very low at present in India because they are not OBF ready. Definitely anecdotal evidence suggests that NPO has led to a lot of attrition. There have been some negative impacts also. Definitely there has been quite a lot of positive impact in terms of strengthening of the data systems and processes. The second learning is definitely clearly defined, measurable and verifiable outcomes. That's extremely crucial, and any ambiguity to not defining outcomes, which is very much possible in some of the themes and sectors where people work with the vulnerable communities, people work, for example, like yesterday we were listening to the accidental fall in senior citizens. Defining outcomes over there is extremely critical and extremely difficult a job. So definitely that's a lot of, that's also quite a lot of learning in this space. Strong data collection and monitoring mechanisms are essential to track the progress and definitely make the necessary course corrections which can be there over a period of time. The fourth learning is definitely it requires a lot of ownership from the government and the local governments to scale up intervention. Unfortunately, it's still not very much attraction which has gained in India, as I said, but definitely in here, in most of the developed economies, the government has been very supportive. It has been very engaging in scaling up these interventions. The fifth large lesson is definitely the legal contracts, which take up a lot of the cost considerations. So definitely the cost implications of the overall structure is something which we have been hearing a lot in the discussions also, and are quite a concern for the NPOs. And as I said, that the smaller NPOs, they do not have that cost to bear for these legal contracts. The sixth one is definitely in terms of having a proof and a scalable intervention which can be taken up. So having a proof of concept and a scalable intervention is definitely needed in order to take up the OBF contracts. Next. So in this whole scenario, the NPOs are definitely facing a lot of challenges. Defining clear measurable outcomes have been difficult for them. Excessive focus on outcomes that is definitely a concern, a critical concern, because it can leave out some of the most vulnerable populations in want of speedy delivery of outcomes. And that's something which has been a cause of concern, debated in a lot of the sessions which we have been seeing. Excessive metrification risk of reducing complex social issues to very narrow, very specific outcome metrics. I think it's a very low innovation in terms of moving from outputs to outcomes. So definitely it's a challenging thing. For example, in any education program, it definitely can focus on some of the outcomes in education, but what about the emotional content, or what about the emotional well-being of the students? That cannot be taken care of in outcomes because that's a long-term proposition. Focus on short-term outcomes rather than long-term impact. It has definitely been one of the major challenges of any outcomes-based funding interventions. But definitely some of the focus of the root causes that can get negated if there's no proper intervention. In many cases, lack of reliable data and complexity of measuring the real world outcomes, that has definitely limited the scalability of the contracts. There are several other challenges as well, but definitely I would want to limit the challenges and the concerns to this, and very specifically also mention that the smaller NPOs, they definitely they don't have the capacity to onboard the OBF contract. So what can be done in that? And most of the research in our center, the Center for Innovative Finance, is towards that, one of the larger focus.
Okay, just 1 minute left.
Okay. Yeah. So in what we do in CIFC is majorly focus on this. And the center is a center of excellence, and it aims to make a paradigm shift in this donor-driven funding narrative of securing funds. And definitely it can be brought through by mainstreaming innovative finance and bringing in private capital into the space and having a very level playing ground for funders and the donors, no matter what financing approach it undertakes. So CIFC's work definitely underscores the need for equal participation of NPOs along with other stakeholders, and tailor the needs of the organizations, and definitely bring in the relevant knowledge and capacity building tools for the sector. So these are the three major objectives. One is bringing in more capital in the center. The second is assessing the impact of the activities, and the third is interactions with the regulatory communities. And definitely CIFC is majorly moving and doing a lot of work in the first two objectives.
We nearly just finished up, just one.
Yeah, okay, I will just take one more minute.
Thank you.
So we're doing this with knowledge, practice, and creating the communities of research and practice. In knowledge, definitely a lot of work is creating the alternatives for impact assessment, how impact can be done differently, creating innovative finance tools and instruments. And definitely in terms of influencing practice, we are working with funders. We are yet to have a lot of discussions with funders, but we have started working with the NPOs to develop their capacity building modules. And in terms of creating communities, we have research communities, we have the research fellowships, and definitely in terms of OBF readiness, we also are bringing out a framework. Just one more slide. You can skip this, because this is largely about CIFC's approach, and it takes care of all these things. So largely, the next slide, please. Okay, and the next. Maybe I will just briefly talk about 30 seconds for this.
Right, 30 seconds.
So this basically is the outcomes readiness framework, which we are doing in association with the British Asian Trust and Atma. And this is basically to develop a framework for the NPOs in order that they are able to assess their potential, their readiness in terms of onboarding OBF contracts. So we are going to launch this framework in a forthcoming conference in November, but the whole tool is to develop the framework and to convert it in a web tool. So that's what we aim to do. So yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. And I mean, there's so much detail here, and I think we could have had a whole seminar about this. There's so much, but absolutely, it's hard to stick to that when you've done so much work in this, but there's so much learning in India. There's a few things that I'm really interested in, social stock exchange, and some of the things you said, we'll bring them up. But also we can share these slides, because I'm sorry that we hasn't been able to show them all to you because of the time limits, but the detail here is incredible, and it's going to give you some great ideas. So thank you for that. So now we're going to move on to Russ, who is online in Australia. I'm hoping he's a jolly swag man and he's still awake because it's Friday night there. Russ, over to you.
Thanks very much, Katie. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, great. Starting my timer. Firstly, an apology that I can't be with you. This is probably my third or fourth conference I've had to attend here online. My great hope is to be there with you all one day. I was really pleased to see words pop up early in the Slido, co-design, engagement. We've talked also about accountability, local skills, flexibility and access. I guess my approach here is to think about why we don't do empowerment and co-design well. What is it that's stopping us do that? How do we what does it mean to practically create an environment that allows people that voice and allows us to get to outcomes, the outcomes we need to achieve? Within an environment of complexity, and I think that's what really drives me, and I'm sure drives many of you, which is why we're so fascinated by the outcomes environment. Next slide, please, John. So, what does it mean to empower voices? What does it practically mean? It doesn't happen in a vacuum. There needs to be some sort of set of parameters created. So, what does that look like so that we give people clarity? And the same goes for co-design, proper co-design. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs to have some boundaries so that people are clear about what's possible and what's not possible. I want to share with you very briefly a couple of examples in Australia and then get to my conclusion and my call to action for us. If you could move to the next slide, please, John. Very briefly, my experience is deeply embedded in social impact bonds here in Australia, and I'm now currently leading co-design and engagement for our National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's about a 35-40 billion pound scheme, so a big endeavour. Next, please, John. And on to the first example, which will be the next slide. So one of our state jurisdictions here was concerned about the lack of service provision that brought multiple service silos together for a chronic homeless cohort, and so it moved via a recommissioning from 75 individualised contracts to 5 region-wide alliance-based contracts. So this was this state government's attempt to try and empower localised agencies to bring together the services in a way that made sense for the users of the services and the providers of those services, rather than it being dictated to via government contracts. The alliances were required to self-organise and bring a full end-to-end homelessness service response together. They came together to envisage a new system as much as they could, but in the case of the entity that we supported, there was no separate entity created. They all worked within their own organisational environment, but with an MOU, a memorandum of understanding above them. Just quickly, if we can move to the next slide, which is what worked and what didn't. In this case, there was a very strong bond amongst the agencies. So that word collaboration that we heard Lucy talk about earlier, there was a very strong desire, vision to work together and make sure that the partnership worked, and a very clear shared purpose and a growing identity. This entity is now in its 4th or 5th year. A very dynamic CEO or alliance managers kept the whole thing together, and a well-documented service model was its blueprint. But what didn't work so well, and thinking about how cross-sector partnerships should be governed, each agency retained its own budget. It wasn't able to shift funding easily between either organisations or within service streams within the consortium. So if you think about end-to-end crisis response to short-term accommodation for homelessness, there's a range of service needs in there, and they weren't quickly able to shift those because government still wanted control of how the funding was allocated. Each agency had its legacy data system, and Louise talked about data, and no doubt everyone has a lot over the last couple of days. So shared data was only at the margin, so they didn't ever have one single view of the client moving through the system, nor of how each agency was performing according to the original blueprint. Each staff member, while they identified as an alliance member, was still employed by the home agency. They reported up to that home agency. So where there were conflicts between the alliance, this cross-sector partnership, and their home employer, typically the home employer, so to speak, won out. And the strong political bureaucratic reporting overlay really made managing performance and, as I said earlier, shifting resources within the partnership very challenging. So that was the first example there where government tried to provide an environment where cross-sector partnership could emerge, but the old habits died hard, and it was difficult to do. The second example, please, if you could move on, John, was a regional Indigenous community looking at employment outcomes. A consortium was formed to negotiate an outcomes-based contract with the state government here. But the parties didn't work so well. If we could flick to what worked and what didn't work so well, please, John. Each organisation, as we've heard earlier, these organisations that are very close to their community knew their role very well, knew their strengths, and they all came together and had a very clear mission. But their lack of experience in outcomes contracting and their lack of sophistication around governance and an agreement meant that the fact they hadn't worked together previously meant it was very, very clunky. And there was also the aspect, again, you would have talked about the financing elements of these things. That wasn't very clear either. So just to quickly move through to some conclusions, please, John, and I'll do this very quickly. My view is that we need to create the space and the structures for cross-sector partnerships to work and for real empowerment to emerge. Otherwise, we're going to continue to use these words just as words and not as great, not as a way to really empower great resource allocation and activities. So what we need is success and performance metrics. That shared, common, clear view of what success looks like needs to translate into performance metrics. The governance system needs to be in place that allows the parties to manage to that performance level. So we need to be able to manage, and those organisations need to be empowered to do that. It needs to be within certain constraints, clearly, but it needs to have the ability to manage to that. And then to incentivise this self-guided action, there needs to be something in it, inbuilt incentives. Now, that can be financial, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So if we can skip to maybe the next slide, John, I'm wrapping up here. Ultimately, for trust to emerge, we need transparency, accountability, empowerment. Hopefully you've seen in the thread of my slides here, I'm building up almost from a triangle, but unless we're clear about success and performance metrics, we're not going to have transparency amongst our partners and therefore give each other the confidence to work together to those outcomes. Unless we're able to manage to have the governance arrangements that we manage to that success, we're not going to have the accountability that we need for each party to do what they need to do and know that they're being watched and in some cases supported. And then we need the incentives, financial or otherwise. That's the empowerment for organisations. Ultimately, to build trust, we need those three aspects.
Thanks very much, Russ. I mean, that's a really interesting scenario, and also, I mean, showing us what worked and what didn't work. But the word trust to me is the thing that's floating to the surface across all of this. And something else you said really resonated for me, and I hope it did for the panel and the audience, is that actually organisations and systems and processes are getting in the way of this serving people at a local level. And you propose then that we need space and new structures. So I might propose that we go further. We need to design something different that will enable this and not us be pushing against you said that the data sharing was in the edge of the system. That's everywhere I've been. The health systems don't talk to the council systems, don't talk to the national systems. And we're running about trying to fix that. But actually, meanwhile, people are becoming poorer or more vulnerable. So there's what you said very much resonated for all of us here. So thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to move on now all the way to the USA, and we've got Dr. Christina Patterson here from Georgia Southern University.
Thank you. So today I'm presenting 2 case studies of ongoing cross-sector collaboration, which have been very successful at including broad and meaningful community participation. And they both involve government, nonprofit organizations, churches, businesses, a hyperlocal media outlet, and university faculty, while centering the community in that collaboration. And for this presentation, I really tried to focus on aspects of these 2 projects that may be particularly useful for those looking to facilitate this kind of work in your local community. So a little background on the community of focus. Statesboro is a micropolitan city in the state of Georgia, which is in the southeastern part of the United States. It has a population of about 35,000, and about 37% of the population lives under the federal poverty line, which is about 3 times the US national average. It's also the location of a large public regional university, which is where I come from. Can you go to the next slide? And so the first case study is of Statesboro Village Builders, a comprehensive youth serving initiative started in 2022. In October of 2021, we had, based on Kingdon's multiple streams theory, what I would call a focusing event. A fight breaks out at a local high school, and there are a number of students involved. There's injuries, and it's difficult for adults to subdue this fight, and they are scared, and rightfully so. And you're unable to control a situation like that in your school setting. That's scary. So now there's a lot of public community attention on how we need to better serve the community's youth. And so we have, to kind of continue on the Kingdon stream, we have an open policy window. We have an opportunity for change. And we also have what Kingdon would call a policy entrepreneur, and the literature on cross-sector collaboration would call a sponsor, the mayor of Statesboro. He grew up in Statesboro. He's particularly interested in improving opportunities for youth. And he recognizes this opportunity for policy change. And he does 2 key things. He brings the community together for a series of facilitated conversations to determine what they see as priorities to support youth in Statesboro. And second, he reaches out and he builds a core team of 4 people that he'd worked with before on various projects. So he kind of knew their work ethic. He knew that they could be trusted to do this work. And they were knowledgeable and passionate about issues facing youth. And they're also tied in to other organizations and parts of the community. So now we have a team of what would be called champions. And so this team takes the priorities identified by the community, education, mentorship, workforce development, and social determinants like safe housing, access to basic resources, healthcare, mental health care, and starts to design this initiative to address those. And as the initiative takes form, we're continuing to have these community conversations, including 2 specifically with youth participants to get feedback and incorporate that feedback. We had a meeting with community and faith leaders to present the initiative and ask them where they see their organization fitting into this. We had a launch event where we invited the public as well as leaders from community organizations to ask them to volunteer where they have capacity to build out this initiative. And essentially, if we think of a building, the initiative really is the foundation and the framing, and the remainder gets constructed by partner organizations and community members. We also have a hyperlocal media outlet who's a key partner in these conversations, getting the word out to invite people in, live streaming events to include a more diverse range of the community, and continues to be a champion of Village Builders. And so as we worked on getting support from City Council, because at this point, we don't know if this is going to become a city initiative or not, we asked, what can we do with the resources that we have right now? And we started what I think of as one of the most important components of Village Builders, which are mobile resource days. And what we did was divide the city into 5 areas or villages centered around high poverty areas where young people and their families live and may lack transportation. And the mobile resource days bring existing community organizations with resources into these villages to connect with families. And so an initial budget for Village Builders was approved in the fiscal year 2023 budget, and a director was hired by the city So it became an official city initiative. But by this time, the community already felt ownership of Village Builders. I'm getting choked up a little bit. I was, as you might guess, I was on the team. So it's like close to my heart. And there was incredible buy-in and incredible support and this willingness to collaborate. You can go to the next slide. And so currently, we have a mentorship program, literacy programming, a summer internship program, and we continue the mobile resource days, sometimes with as many as 50 community organizations providing connection to resources. And it's a bit early to have moved the needle on measurements of the community identified goals, but Statesboro was selected by the Georgia Municipal Association for the Visionary City Award. Sorry, getting choked up again. Recognizing achievements in fostering positive community change through effective cross-sector collaboration. So this to me is an indicator of success of this initiative. Go to the next slide. And so the second case study focuses on an ongoing collaboration with the United Way of Southeast Georgia, which is our local United Way chapter. And it really grew out of a conversation during the Village Builders launch, during which the executive director of United Way and I kind of figured out how some of the needs and goals of that organization fit with capacities of my academic department at Georgia Southern. And the partnership really grew organically from there. We started a nonprofit leadership workshop series, which brings together local nonprofit leaders to build capacity and build relationships among the organizations to enable collaboration to better address community problems. Our MPA students have done internships there. But what I want to highlight today is the use of the data walk to really bring in community voices and help identify community problems. Oh my gosh, I'm already almost out of time. Has anyone done a data walk here? Okay, darn. Well, it's I can share some information later about it, but it's a really wonderful way to kind of provide support to bring in community voices. You center conversation around one piece of data and facilitate kind of a short conversation around that. Kind of limits. It provides information so you don't have to be pre-informed, and it kind of limits the conversation. It's harder to bring in your own agenda. And I'm out of time, so if you want to just go for the last slide, the call to action. And so really kind of thinking of what to do, how to move forward, what to do, how to do this kind of work. I think the real key is to build authentic relationships. And by authentic relationships, I mean not waiting to build relationships with members or partners of organizations because they might be good collaborators in the future, but building them based on mutual interests, which then, if there are opportunities for collaboration, then emerge, and they sort of are already based on this foundation of trust. The second is to have concrete goals, and I would argue concrete community-defined goals, but a really flexible structure so that there is a meaningful way for partners to come in and collaborate in a way that's mutually meaningful. And then the final is really to include ongoing, meaningful, broad community participation. So not just a space for community voice at the beginning and move on and we ask the community, we're good, we know what you want, but continue to go back to the community and continue to make those spaces and provide those supports to invite people in a meaningful way.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. What you've said really resonates for me. There's so much said there about the ingredients for this to work really well. One of the ingredients is your passion. No, but if you talked about champions and you talked about connectedness, ownership, investing in capacity, relationships, and a spark starting this all off, but the passion of people engaged in it that won't give up about you're pretty tenacious in terms of what you do. So I think that's been really come across here today. So if we're figuring out what the ingredients is here to make these changes and who you would bring together, then I would reflect on what we've heard here. Okay, great stuff. Okay, and then finally, we're going to move on to Hayley and Mark, who are from Warwick Business School just down the road. So they're going to tell us, share their story. And this is our final presentation, and then we'll get into some juicy discussion and change and the checkbooks and you doing things differently.
Yeah.
Okay, over to you, Hayley and Mark.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Hayley Beer, and I'm very excited and inspired to be here, actually. All of this talk about the care and careful and brave work that everybody's doing in this space is just like really buzzing me up. So today, I'll let my colleague introduce himself, but I'm from the University of Warwick at Warwick Business School. I focus mostly on the strengthening and development of the social economy, a lot on social enterprise and impact measurement and outcome-based strategies. This work today is going to be about obstacles to engaging vulnerable communities. I'm not going to delve into the debate about what I mean by privilege and freedom, but hopefully we'll see a little bit of that in the findings that I show you. But first, Mark is going to introduce the project.
Yeah, so could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so I'm Mark Scott. I'm also from Warwick Business School, and I was one of the evaluators alongside Hayley for this project, which is the UK City of Culture in 2021, which was held in Coventry. The UK City of Culture is a programme which is run by the DCMS, and it happens every 4 years. There's been 3 title holders to date. The first was Londonderry in 2013, Hull in 2017, and Coventry in 2021. It's very much a place-based programme, so every City of Culture is completely different and has completely different outcomes and different priorities that it wishes to achieve. So Derry was very much about regeneration, Hull was about economic stability, and Coventry is a marmot city, and it was really about reducing inequalities across the piece. So the ethos of Coventry's programme was really about devolved models of leadership, co-creating the programme with communities from across the city. And in one of the things that we attempted to do a bottom-up social value measurement of the whole programme, which we couldn't quite do, but we at least pushed the methodology forward. But one of the strands that we're going to talk about today is a programme strand called Caring City, which is where the Trust, who were the delivery organisation, worked with 4 third sector organisations which were already in existence in Coventry, already working with beneficiaries. And they focused on 4 areas. So newly arrived communities in the city, young people at risk of criminal exploitation, the homeless community in the city, and citizens who had mental health struggles. And those areas were identified through a collaboration with the City Council in Coventry, who had data and identified those as communities who were most at risk. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we did have a theory of change sitting behind our evaluation. It was an impact evaluation. We had a lot more outcomes than what I've heard projects have had today. So we had 15 outcomes in total, which were worked on with the city and for the city. So it was a collaboration of different agencies, and it was really about reducing those inequalities through Coventry being a marmot city. So these are just some of our final results of what we got. So the interesting one is a 14% overall increase in participation, cultural participation in Coventry. In targeted communities, that increase was actually 36%, so quite a significant increase. But working with targeted communities, it did only mean that only 47% of citizens in Coventry engaged with City of Culture. So it does have pros and cons in the approach.
Okay, thank you. So now I want to walk you through a little bit of the main findings that we have concerning the obstacles. And so just for transparency purposes, I was both researching this and the academic lead for the social impact evaluation. So I had tons of observations, like real participation in it. Oh dear. Somebody's mad at me for that. Yeah. Oh my goodness, yes. That was yes.
Into your bunkers, everyone, into your bunkers.
Transparency, but not too much, okay? And these findings are derived longitudinally. So part of the richness of being able to look at these obstacles and some of the solutions was that the data in the study and our participation spans the bidding stage, like all the way through to completion, and now still some data collection in legacy phase. And so what those obstacles were there's 4 here. I want to just highlight that the top 2 are really about beneficiaries, and the bottom 2 are really about employees and other stakeholders in the city. But So if I start with clarity of boundaries, and it was really good to hear Russ say something similar, like this matters. I think we're hearing that a lot, parameters. But for us in City of Culture, what seemed to matter a lot was that these individuals wanted to know what the program would do and how it intersected with other institutions in the city. And so it also resonates with Lucy's message and the fact that individuals that sometimes are seeking these interventions for social impact or social change, they are often intersected and involved with different institutions, but those institutions don't all have the same ethos and mantras and ways of caring for people. And so this can create areas of wrongdoing in some cases and mistrust. And so the more that you can be explicit, or the more that the hosts in the organizations where the cultural producers were able to say, this is how we work with city council, this is where that relationship ends, this is where they might pick up with you afterwards or not, it was easier for them to engage. The other part of it was a clarity of boundaries around what you expect of them. And so I've heard so many wonderful, visionary, ambitious statements, and the way that we measure also sometimes can go for things that are high-level targets or stretch targets, and this is important, but it can put a lot of pressure on beneficiaries who are then measured by, a rejuvenation of a city or attainment of higher, better education outcomes for a population, or the revitalization of an industry. And so, and this mattered a lot. Like, what precisely were these beneficiaries going to be measured on, and how was that what they did or didn't do going to play a part in the success or failure? These things came out as mattering. And so, when you narrow down to just a few things for them, it seemed to go better. Even, for instance, changing the language. So at first we were saying marginalized communities, and somebody said, no, we're the seldom heard. And we changed that. And so there was this clarity of boundaries around the definition of what we meant by impact and how those beneficiaries were playing a part, and clarity of boundaries in terms of how this particular intervention would help them in their life journey, but where it interfaced with other institutions that they might be. Community readiness is about preparing these individuals to contribute. And so there's psychological, resource-based reasons why they might not be able to attend, or even if they did attend, why they might not be able to participate in talking to you and brainstorming with you and ideation with you. Sometimes it's really just about preparing them to be able to do that, and not just assuming that because you offer the opportunity, and even that opportunity is in their local region or down the road, that they will have the skills to come. And so this is something that came out for us. The resource pressures moves us towards thinking about the staff actually and employees that were faced with working on this social impact. And so a lot of times they're working on more than one project, and it can become complicated to balance all of the needs of all of the different beneficiaries. So in the case of City of Culture, there was resignations when the pressures on them became too high. And we realized eventually that this work is so demanding and so draining in a way that they needed more space to focus on particular things. And then the safety of spaces is about really also the community. So as much as we tried to help specific postcodes, there was other wealthier, more typically engaged with culture postcodes that became enraged by the fact that there was not culture happening, programming happening for them. And it's not to dismiss that, it's to say it's a real concern for them. But the fact that they got so upset and wrote news stories and approached their ministers and were angry in public meant that the beneficiaries we were trying to help were in hostile environments socially. And so I can't stress it enough that there's also this need. And so this brings me to the final part of this slide about ceding privilege. And what I really mean by that is that people need help to help others. It's not because we're asking people to give away things or to give up space or to hold space for others. And this is a skill set in and of itself. And I think it was Russ that said that institutions just want to control and do things in their own way, because giving that up means something. And so I just can't call enough attention to the fact that there's important work that needs to be done there too. And repairing freedom capabilities is just a signal that it's not just a utility thing. It's not just a value about whether or not this is a positive thing for the community and they should be there, but like a sends capability approach where they need the capability to be free to engage. And so I'm out of time. I would just leave the call to action on the next slide up there saying to take time to think about these local concerns, these vulnerabilities, and don't assume engagement, and understand what forms of privilege are at play in the areas that you want to do work in.
Thanks so much, Hayley and Mark, for that. And I think the word time's coming there to me, that trust takes time, relationships take time, investment in that time as well, and professionals who are trying to do, they say, a day job for an organisation, if you're asking them to engage in this really good way, it's really hard for them to find the time and energy. That can come frustrating and burnout a professional. So it leads us back to the organisations and systems that we have all described today, letting go of power, letting go of ego, and not serving themselves. And I'm not saying this on purpose, I'm not demonising organisations, just that we've got so used to organisations having their own way of being. So actually, are they serving their own systems and serving themselves? You know, that making it so hard to achieve the outcomes for the beneficiaries that become under pressure. I mean, that's nonsense, really, isn't it? About culture. So some brilliant stuff there, but time and trust are coming through here, flexibility, we're hearing words, and they're all very human words. Even right back to our first presentation from Lucy, you know, it was very much about listening to people and recognising people's life experience as we go ahead to serve them. So human words to describe a lot of things and not processes and systems and organisations, they seem in some ways to be the blocker, particularly when multi-ones come together and they're finding it hard to let go of a budget or an ethos that maybe doesn't tie in. So some brilliant presentations, and I think you'll all agree with that. And now we're going to get you lot involved, because we don't want you to go away from here just thinking, well, that was the last session in the Friday or second last session. We really want you to engage with us. So we're going to open up to some questions for the panel. You can say specifically who you would like to ask the question of, or a general one, and get a bit of discussion. And then we are going to do this Slido. We can do that while we're doing this, doing the discussion. But really, we want to know, if this is a timeshare question, what are you going to do differently because of what you've heard today? And if you have, we'll know we've got you all programmed. So if you don't make a comment, you won't be allowed to leave. You'll have to forever and ever with the Slido going round and round. So you can start feeding the Slido about what you might do differently from what you've heard. But let's open up to questions then. Is anyone? Yes, I've got a question right here.
I just wondered if the panel could talk to a little bit. We've talked a bit about power and privilege and about engaging people. And I really love Lucy's comment about, you know, I grow and you grow and our community grows. And when I look around the space here, I'm really blown away by how privileged it is. I went to a real comprehensive school and grew up similar situations to Lucy and things. I wonder how many people in this space are from the marginalised communities or the seldom heard communities that we're talking about. So how do we stop being the privileged saviour going in and repairing these communities and actually allow those people to do the work themselves? I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but I would really like to hear about that.
It's really interesting. And, you know, just from my own experience from leading kind of system change work in Scotland, you know, this thing you're right about, kind of things being done to people who are underprivileged. One of the things I discovered very quickly is the horizontal connections between communities. So in East Ayrshire, we started with ex-mining communities doing work where they were planning their own action plan, their own way of being, their own community-led. And so some of the mining communities were way ahead of some of the more affluent communities. And then they said, well, we would like an action plan. And rather than us dropping in, we said, we'll go and speak to the people of Nether Thirds. You know, they might be in all the scale, they might, in your eyes, be a poorer community, but they've got a plan and they're bringing in millions of pounds. So I wonder if people reflect on that sometimes our job as professionals is to get out of the way and connect people horizontally. And I just wondered if in the City of Culture, if that would have changed, if there had been horizontal connections between those that were complaining and those that we were trying to help. Because I think that then means professionals step back and enable. What do the rest of the panel think about power and privilege? It sounds like a really big blockbuster, this. Who wants to go? Do you want to go, yeah?
I can say something from an international development perspective, because I think, you know, very, very conscious that actually, and this was mentioned this morning as well, you know, a lot of international development is still premised on a very kind of pseudo-colonial basis. I'm also comprehensively school educated, but have had a lot of privilege in my life. And I guess as a development professional, that is something I wrestle with. I'm also Oxford based, which means I have access. And I guess the way that I personally reconcile this, and I guess to some extent in my work, is to try and put that privilege in the service of communities that have less voice, less ability to access the kinds of stakeholders or actors that I access, and then think about, well, how can I create platforms for those organizations, those people to come into those conversations? And I guess that's at the heart of what we're trying to do.
Real servant leadership then.
Yeah.
So basically our job isn't to fix or to preach, but actually to serve and to find out what that person wants individually or that community wants and needs. And then we find a way to connect, as we heard a lot from America. I want to come on to Lucy. Lucy, what's your take on power and privilege?
I tie, as some people I've worked with there will know, I tie everything to education because that's my background. And I think what runs through all the educational reports, and I mean, like some of you have mentioned, I've grown up, there were 6 of us, we shared trainers, we boiled the kettle for a bath. That's the kind of upbringing we've had. But I don't think we needed someone to come and give us trainers. I think what we needed is someone to say or affirm that experience actually is not necessarily a negative or a bad thing. It's my experience. And those things have informed me going forwards. Values, morally, all those different things actually do have strength. Educationally, everything always comes back to it's negative teacher assumptions, which I can vouch for. Yeah, it is. Teenagers get a bad rep anyway. So then when you add gender and race and area, postcode, that does happen. And that is exactly how I felt at the sharp end of services. Assumption, none of which were serving me at all.
Fantastic. And that graphic really showed that in that slide, and the zoom in on it about the feeling before and then during and then after, in terms of having labels attached based on what services, what categories, services or systems would put you into. But the process you described was one that started with you and started with people and didn't start with what the available solutions that we have are. Brilliant. Okay, one more panel member about power and privilege, and then we'll move on.
So I think it sort of goes without saying, and I think hit on this as well, you have to have leadership that is willing to cede power and recognize where power differentials exist and be willing to invite people in that can can engage processes to mitigate those. But something a little more concrete, I think, that I know that we did with Village Builders is all the literature that went out to the community after it was launched was specifically from removed all deficit-based language and was shifted to asset-based language. That's sort of a concrete thing that I think was meaningful in kind of shifting the narrative away from those who have power and privilege to those that we consider serving or that don't have that power and privilege. So that's a concrete thing I think that can be done.
Language came up a number of times, didn't it? And some people say it's just semantics, but I certainly know in my own work that we moved away towards citizens and co-producers and neighbours, as opposed to people who are service users or customers. Customers are entitled, and actually we should all be part in public service of our own solution. So our customer is a passive recipient waiting to be served, and then they get angry when they're not. But actually a neighbour is someone who wants to be part of the solution. So I think language, that's a massive point. Okay, I'm just coming in here, a really good one that really reflects what we heard here as well from Ria about I think it's disappeared. It's gone too fast.
Ensuring long-term
ensuring long-term ambitions are included in programmes that target vulnerable communities, going beyond outcomes, speedy delivery and metrics. That was a real note of caution for you, Ria. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, absolutely. So like in the entire research that we are doing, the focus, whatever we are seeing is definitely the emphasis is more on outcomes, how to define outcomes, what are the sectors where outcomes can be defined. But then it's a dangerous thing we are moving into. And as I said that in my presentation, I highlighted that there are some very impending dangers of focusing only on outcomes. So in our research, we are very consciously trying to move the needle from outputs to outcomes to impact. How do we see impact in a different manner? What is that in impact measurement that organizations really need to think about? How do they conceptualize impact and how do they really see the impact on ground? What can be done there? Is it really important to use the standard frameworks and matrices on impact which exist today in India? Because most of the organizations, NPOs, the smaller NPOs out there, they do not have the standardized impact networks or impact matrices. So how that can be done differently? Okay. So maybe next year, if I come back, I'll be able to share more insights on the research we are doing, because it's a very pioneering research on looking at impact differently, and definitely have a much better much better overview of outcomes by taking a very long-term proposition.
No, absolutely. The impact's so important. The bigger impact with a big I. But what is the impact of my conversation with you? What is the impact that my service has had on you and your community? What does that conversation look and feel like? And that's so important, because that takes us to legacy and how people feel kind of imbued in systems that don't hear them. So really interesting. Okay, I'm going to go to another question now. I've got somebody ready. Yep. No, it's just a checkbook this time. No, it's a question. Right. Okay, carry on.
Hi, thanks to the panel. My name's Bryony. I work for Brink. I've got a question, for anyone who wants to answer it, but particularly building on Hayley's point around resignations with the kind of emotional labour of the staff. And Russ spoke about kind of moving organisations to consortium, but kind of expecting the organisations to kind of self-organise. I really believe how we do the work is as important as the work that we do. So I wondered what the panel's kind of comments on the role of funders and organisations to support really good and healthy working for everyone is.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Absolutely. About how we do the work. Absolutely. So, on to yourself. You give us the first answer and then we'll take to Russ.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. Yeah. So it's a great question. I think during Coventry City of Culture, we didn't quite figure it out in time. I think it revealed the fact that, you want to use culture as a catalyst for change, but I could translate culture into many different things. Like, we're at a time where, excitingly, we are leveraging many different economic resources to create and catalyze social change. But the thing is that these individuals were trained cultural producers. They weren't necessarily trained counselors, psychologists, social care workers, nurses. There is caring professions out there. And so, one of the things that comes out in this is, I think there's something about potentially gearing up these individuals to work more directly with vulnerable communities. And there's plenty of options. There's that should be decided based on those particular needs and the vulnerabilities and the world of concerns and traumas that are present. I do think that when we want to involve hyper-locally organizations to help us or help governments or other funders to create social change, we need to look at what needs to be equipped inside those organizations and take the time to train them beforehand or along the way. And secondly to that is has to do with impact measurement. And so more and more we see that impact measurement is used as a process. So it's used to design, to measure, to maximize impact. But this also requires a lot of skills, especially the bottom-up participatory methods. They require a lot of listening, a lot of digression, disagreement, confusion, and being able to hold space for all of that is not something that we all do well. You know, the amount of times that you would hear somebody say, well, I've made the choice and that's what we're sticking with, or we're just going to move on. And so like living with the idea that you don't have a solid answer, but you have to find some sort of consensus and agreement is a ginormous skill set that I think we underestimate when we put people in the impact measurement role in these positions across these projects.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. When we were talking about the ingredients for this work to work well, we need people with that skill set. Because if we don't have that enabler, that facilitator, the person who can hold space, have that coaching conversation, a deep listener, then it could affect the whole thing. So we need to understand the skills and talents needed for the ingredients for this kind of change. And can I bring Russ in and I'll bring us up? But Russ, you know, hindsight's 2020 vision. One of the things you said was really that, you know, when those organisations came together, there was blockers because of the different cultures of them and their ability to let go of their egos. So if you were doing it all again, Russ, in terms of bringing them together, what could be learned? What could we do to try and bring people into common ground?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think was it Bryony, was it? I really appreciate your thinking on this too. I've spent a lot of time working with social organisations who are fighting a system. Basically, I think to be honest, the system is working against us, working across complex and multiple service areas. We are fed, you know, down through silos, through tubes that come through. You know, administrative systems. So as a consequence, our organisations aren't great at this, largely through no fault of our own. I think there are some cultural issues to deal with for sure, but certainly the structures don't help. So look, I you know, on the one hand, I'm very hopeful, but on the other hand, you know, until we can shift our world to more of an outcomes-based and outcomes-led environment where we have the flexibility, where we're not being told how many widgets need to be delivered on these days at these times, where we are free to innovate and create space and hold space, then I think we're going to struggle. I really do think we're going to struggle. And I think the 10 or 15 years or so of social impact bonds gives us that evidence. So what I would do differently, I would be pushing the service providers, the collaboration, to push their commissioners to be brave. You know, we need courage in this environment. So the organisations need strong leaders themselves, but if you can find those organisations with those strong leaders to say, no, we are going to do something different here, you need the commissioner on the other side to accept that. That's advocacy. I think that's system level advocacy that we really do need. Otherwise, we're going to continue to do this really important stuff only at the margins.
Whether, you know, those of you that know me think in terms of public service transformation, that community power needs to be at the heart of that. And actually the systems and hierarchies need to dissolve a bit for us to move into this new way of being. But people either don't want to hear that because it's scary or they just don't know how it will work. But actually it's going to happen anyway, because we're not going to solve some of the most difficult issues that we have with the resource that we have in the 21st century. So it's whether it's done to us or we're part of the definition of that. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a bit. I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we offer technical assistance to our partners and how sort of needs-based we made that. And we didn't really train in a kind of typical way. We didn't come in saying, we think we know what you need. We did to a certain degree with the performance management because we had developed an app. We had a very sort of clear way from the measurement perspective. And I think there was a real desire to learn that. But when it came to delivery and advice and mentorship and coaching, I mean, the whole program itself is called Friend. So Maitri means friend in Hindi. And so we very much offered a space to our partners to ask us for what they needed and didn't say, we're going to train you in how to enroll. We're going to train you in how to do a door-to-door survey. It was there and available if wanted, but it very much came from the partners. So they did want some support in recruitment. We did actually help and sit in on project management interviews. We would never have thought of maybe saying we need to do that for our partners, but they wanted that. And so we really became the sort of friend to the organizations. And that's kind of, I think that was really helpful in terms of building trust, transparency, and in a way separating the performance management as where the accountability and the rigor is, but then a very sort of touchy-feely sort of, a real warmth between us in terms of how they could reach out for additional support.
That's fantastic. So warmth to me is about trust, it's about relationships, and you use the word space. So space is so important, space maybe without agenda to give time to build up that kind of trust. Okay, I mean, a lot of what you're all going to go away and do after this is really resonating here. It's about being mindful about building relationships and the time taken, building and trust, understanding outcomes matter most to those who intend to benefit early. And it was, somebody said, I think it was Russ, about skin in the game. People have to be bought into this and own it to be part of it, not being done too. Okay, we've got a wee bit more time, so let's see what anybody else got another question that they would like to ask. Yep.
Thanks. Maybe I'll start yelling.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I'm going to take the conversation a little bit more technical for a minute, and I actually have two questions, if you could indulge me. The first question is to those of you who are involved in outcome-based finance. And I wondered, you talked a lot about the results-based finance, but you didn't talk about due diligence and compliance. And for me, compliance is one of the major blockers to everything that all of us are trying to do in changing these systems and working more with local communities. So I wondered if you had any experiences of doing due diligence, if you've gotten around compliance regimes of particularly international funders. And I think, was it Haley or no, I'm sorry, the woman from the University of Georgia, sorry, forget your name. Georgia Southern. You mentioned speaking with asset-based language instead of deficit-based language. So I wondered if any of you have ever explored asset-based due diligence versus deficit-based due diligence. So that's the first sort of technical question. Second question is to all of you. It seems to me that everyone on this panel is about changing a really entrenched system. And you've all talked about measuring outcomes or outputs and outcomes and impact, but no one's talked about how you measure change. And I'm just curious as to whether anyone has come up with or anyone knows about any kind of a framework for measuring systems change or change at all. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think we'll start with the second one because I've got somebody nodding here frantically. Mark talked about using theory of change. So I think we'll maybe hear from him, and then I think we'll hear from Tina about, I love that idea, asset-based, what did you say, asset-based due diligence?
Compliance versus...
It's almost like an oxymoron, but it's cool. I like it. Yeah. Okay, yourself first.
Yeah, so we had a theory of change which was created through consultation with citizens of Coventry, the organisations in Coventry, because being a city of culture is not about one organisation's partnership across the piece. But behind that theory of change was measurable citizen-based metrics. So Coventry is a city which runs a household survey every 2 years where they survey 4,000 households in the city. So they get a representative sample and it allows us to see what changes from every 2 years. And that was where the majority of our data came from in terms of being able to measure that change. But with all of these programs that we were talking about today, we also did a social return on investment study where we worked directly with the beneficiaries who defined their own outcomes about what they personally wanted to achieve through the program. And that was measured at a beneficiary level because obviously those communities are quite small in the grand scheme of things. But because we were able to monitor it very closely, we were able to monitor things such as policy change within the city council, which came about because of one of the cultural outputs that was produced. So it was really a multifaceted approach to really measure that change.
That's a really good answer. And I think everybody could probably say something about that. And I weren't conscious of time, but I know that all the panel members, there's details. And I think that's a really interesting thing about change. But I want to hear from Tina now about your first point.
So I understood your question to be more directed at people who were doing more impact-based financing or outcomes-based financing. Was that not?
It doesn't. If anyone has any ideas about how to do compliance better from an approach of what you have versus what you want as an organization. If you're trying to vet an organization, as many in past organizations, have you approached that from a position? What is this organization capable of versus what they don't and how they can?
Right. That does make sense. And I think that is a wonderful way to approach building relationships with organizations and building collaborations. I mean, I really think kind of an asset inventory, and instead of, we usually think of doing a needs assessment, doing more of an asset assessment where having the organizations kind of articulate this is what we bring to the table. This is what we're particularly good at, and kind of weaving your map of what assets are available in partnerships based on that, I think would be excellent.
So where you were seeing where the strengths are and then where the gaps might be. You guys want to come in on that one?
Yeah. So I mean, we struggle with this. You know, how prescriptive should we be about the tick box exercise of due diligence? We were going to be spending internationally raised funding, so the funding was coming from an international part of our organisation. So we have a US 501c3 as Educate Girls, but we really lent into the knowledge and expertise of our local partner, Educate Girls in India, to guide us on what was imperative, what was good to have, and what was nice to have but not imperative. And there were sort of blurred lines there. We had to sort of flex that approach a bit as we progressed. And we did at certain stages have very clear sort of turnover thresholds, but then we lent into the advice of our local partner and the feedback we were getting from the CBOs we were doing due diligence on. And some of them were saying, COVID has hit us so extremely on the funding, we can't make that threshold, but look at what we can do. And so the other thing was, we're an education organisation. We were looking at organisations to engage with education systems, but we didn't prescribe that they had to have any experience in education, because we could see their asset, and what we were wanting to drive the achievement of our outcomes was their community knowledge and their ability to influence and change mindsets in a village. So whereas you might have had a particular sort of due diligence framework that says, obviously they've got to have education experience, we wiped that. So we were kind of prepared to take the risk of some of the usual compliance kind of metrics not being met. And then we built an attrition, knowing that we would make mistakes. So we knew we thought we'd lose about 4 organisations. We only lost 2 to kind of underperformance and an inability to actually rise to what we were hoping to achieve together.
That risk was worth it, because obviously you did more because of that. So you took the risk, that flexibility, so that ability to deviate a wee bit within a reason. You've got it planned, you rate the risk, you understand it, but you're doing it because the gains could be better. Yeah. Okay, we're just coming to the end of the session now, and I'm conscious we're going in for a coffee, and you all know, you can see that all the panel members are here and they're really up for talking to you, during coffee time. I've got to say, this is one of the most passionate panels that I've ever chaired, because people here really care about the work. You've all seen that, haven't you? They brought a lot of themselves to this real passion, and I want to give them a great big round of applause and thank you very much. So I think, am I right in saying it's on to coffee now? Yes? Leave some tea bags. Yes. I guess Great, well done, guys. There's a lot to fit in. You did brilliantly. Next year, though, love to hear more about what happens next. It's a lot new.